Good evening, everybody. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I know folks are still working their way here, but given that this presentation is going to be a little long, we want to go ahead and get started so that we have time for questions and comments at the end. My name is Ian McMillan. I'm a planning and rules manager here at the South Coast SCAQMD. A few of my colleagues are still on the road. Unfortunately, there's a pretty bad traffic coming all the way out from Diamond Bar, but we definitely appreciate you welcoming us to your community here. This is the second working group for proposed amended Rule 1118. This is the rule the Air District has on refinery flares. I do want to just preface this right now. This is not really meant to be a general air quality concerns meeting. This is really kind of focused a little bit more on the technical nitty-gritty of rulemaking and what are the specific provisions that should go into a rule and what district staff is thinking of, and then an opportunity after we walk through the presentation for you all to provide your comments that you have right now. There'll be plenty of time in the future for comments as more details keep coming along in this process. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. I should say, sitting here to my right is Daphne Sue. She's legal counsel on this. We have our two rule writers right up front here, Dyra Moody and Eugene Tessler, and then some other staff will be working their way in as we keep going here. Okay. The agenda, just very briefly, we sent an email out about this. We'll go through a little bit of an introduction, talk a little bit about planned and unplanned flaring events, go through a comparison with the federal regulations that were recently updated, walk through what our thoughts are right now about remote sensing of flares and a pilot program we're thinking about for that. Talk a little bit about the fees associated with Rule 1118, and then we'll get into the next steps and then questions and comments. I should say, if there are clarifying, just a very quick question, hey, I didn't hear what you said, can you just explain what that term means? Feel free to just raise your hand and ask a clarifying question. But for longer questions and comments, if you could hold that to the end, I appreciate it. Very briefly, many of you know who we are, some of you might not. The South Coast Air Quality Management District, we are the local air pollution control agency for this portion of Southern California. There's about 16+ million people in our jurisdiction, 28,000 permitted sources. We are governed by a board of local elected and appointed officials. We have a staff in our agency of 700+ staff that implements all of our own rules and regulations. We had our first working group about a month ago. At this working group, we walked through some of the background information that was that staff was looking at to understand what is happening with flaring and what information do we know about flaring, and then to propose some rule concepts, thinking about how we might want to amend the rule. We are proposing this in two phases. The first phase would include a scoping document that refineries would prepare to kind of look at a goal of zero planned flaring emissions. I'm going to go into this in a lot more detail later on in the presentation. Secondly, we want to make sure that we're harmonizing this rule, the Rule 1118, with the federal requirements. There's been some recent updates to the federal requirements, so we want to make sure that those are harmonized in one place. We'll be looking at the emission estimation methods to understand, make sure we have a solid understanding of what emissions are coming out of flaring. And then again, this remote sensing pilot program I mentioned, as well as the EPA guidance on emissions. We also will be proposing to make some changes to the mitigation fee structure within the rule. And that's all in this first phase. When I say the first phase, that's in the coming months. And then the idea will be that some of the work that would happen in that first phase, in particular the scoping document and the remote sensing pilot program, would lead into the second phase, which would come probably more than a year from now to build off of that first work that's been done in this first phase. Slides from that first rule are available online, and all of the rule documents will be available at that link. Just very briefly, how does a rule development process work in general at the Air Quality Management District? We gather information, we develop our rule concepts. We're kind of, where we are in this stage right now, we're kind of in the rule concepts, getting towards proposed rule language. We aren't quite there at draft rule language yet, but we're drafting it right now based on some of the concepts we've gone through before, and we'll go into more detail today. We'll refine that proposed rule language based on a lot of feedback that we're expecting, and then eventually that rule would be taken to our governing board for their consideration. Okay, so let's get into it. So planned versus unplanned flaring. Really, when we think about flaring, there's actually a lot of different kinds of categories of flaring. Specifically in the rule itself, there's about 15 different categories of flaring. We went through some of those detailed categories at the last meeting. It kind of boils down to three main types of flaring, though. There's unplanned events, emergencies. Something happens, a valve breaks, something happens, and there's a malfunction, and there's a lot of extra gas, and it needs to be flared for safety reasons. There's also external disruptions, such as a power outage at the local utility, a natural disaster like an earthquake, things that are generally more outside of the control of the refinery itself. And that really kind of encompasses the unplanned events. When we look at the planned events, that's sort of the planned startups and shutdowns of units as those go through their normal routine maintenance. You have turnaround events that again, are shutting down and starting up units. There's maintenance activities that are planned. There's non-emergency flaring that can happen. And so it's kind of more of a different kind of reason why the planned events would be occurring. And then there's this third column that's a little bit more nebulous called essential operational need. And really this is, there's a number of different subcategories within this essential operational need. For example, there might be a pressure or temperature excursion on a single process unit at the facility that requires extra gases to be flared. There might be some imbalances in the fuel gas system, some incompatible gases that can't be used in the fuel gas system. There's a lot of sort of nitty-gritty details about this essential operational need. When we look overall, though, at the kind of flaring that occurs, if we break it out into these three categories, the unplanned sort of, on the pie chart there on the right really sort of dwarfs everything, right? It's the major source of emissions as what's been reported to us by the quarterly reports that facilities provide to us. We see that the unplanned events are more than half. The planned events are about a third, and the essential operational need are a small fraction of that, right? It's only about 7%. If we look at this in a little bit more detail, and we did this at the last meeting, this is the same graph that we presented at the last meeting, we can actually break out from those unplanned events, 8 events in particular at the Torrance refinery. The reported emissions from those 8 events are actually a significant fraction of that pie chart, about 42%. And so for those 8 events, there's potential ways to address those kinds of events at the Torrance refinery. We have our hearing board. We had an order for abatement go through for that. We talked about that at the last working group. But sort of setting those emissions aside for the time being, if we look at what's remaining, we see that of this remaining part of the pie chart, about 2/3 of it would be the planned and the essential operational need, and about 1/3 of it is the unplanned emissions. And I should say that there are, as routinely happens, as facilities report their emissions, sometimes more information becomes available, and then some revisions will be submitted, and so there are some requests for revised emissions. So this pie chart could change a little bit in the future, but in general, this is the information we have right now. Quick question. Yes. Sure, that graphic, that's actually, this graphic is the exact same as in the first presentation. So if you need a copy of it, it's in that first one. I just wanted to show the linkage. Okay? Okay, so to drill down into this a little bit more on the planned versus unplanned flaring, currently Rule 1118 has something called a performance target, and this performance target sets a threshold, and this threshold is 0.5 tons of sulfur oxide emissions per million barrels of crude capacity. And this threshold is used for 2 different ways. The first is that if the threshold is exceeded, there are mitigation fees that a facility will need to pay. And secondly, they will also need to prepare a flare minimization plan to show how they're not going to exceed that threshold in the future. What we're proposing right now is, instead of having just a single threshold for all flaring events, with the exception of power disruptions or other externally controlled events, instead of having just one threshold, the idea would be to maybe split this threshold into sort of planned and unplanned. As an example, maybe it's 0.25 tons on the planned side and 0.25 tons on the unplanned side. We still will expect facilities to continue to report all 15 subcategories, but each of these subcategories would really get assigned into these 2 larger broad categories. When we look at the essential operational needs, this is something where it gets a little tricky, and we're still working exactly how to divvy up some of these different kinds of categories. There's a lot of essential operational needs that have been reported. Over 16,000 events have been reported from all the refineries over the last 5 years. And that's resulted in about 84 tons of SOx. Again, that's a very small fraction, about 7% total of total SOx emissions that have been reported. But really, of these 16,000, 5 of them have caused 83% of emissions. So we get this sort of a relationship in a lot of different ways when we look at the flaring emissions, that there are large events that cause a lot of emissions, and then there's a lot of smaller events that also are contributing, but it's these large events that they're causing a lot of emissions. On the planned flaring events, want to describe a little bit about our understanding of how flare gas systems work, and that will help illustrate why we're thinking of amending the rule in the way that we are. So first off, why do planned events occur? Under the rule right now, there are certain events that will require what's called a specific cause analysis, where a facility will need to tell us why a flaring event occurred. Usually there's a threshold, an emissions threshold, or a flow rate threshold that a facility will have to tell us why that flaring event occurred. But in the case of most planned events, like startups, shutdowns, and turnarounds, there is no specific cause analysis required. The facility notifies us ahead of time, and as long as they give us that notification ahead of time, they don't have to tell us exactly why there's that particular flaring. We just know it's going to be associated with a startup or shutdown or something like that. What we do know is that in general, as we've been talking to facilities and talking to our compliance staff, in general, these planned events will generally cause flaring because the flares that are, the gas that's going to the flare normally can be recovered in a fuel gas system, but it can't be in that one particular instance. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And I'll go through that in a little bit here. I do want to take a brief second and talk about the general schematic of how flare gas recovery works. And all facilities, all refineries in the South Coast District have a flare gas recovery system. And I think there was some confusion at the last working group on that. Every facility has this. So just in general, if you look at this diagram, and if it's a little small for folks in the back, I apologize. You have the handouts in front of you. Hopefully you can squint and take a look there. In general, as the gases are produced at the refinery from whatever cause or process. If there are gases that are going to the flare, they come in through a gas collection header, and they go to what's called a knockout drum, sometimes called a knockout pot, and this is really just separating the liquids from the gases. And so the liquids will go down to the bottom, and the gases will pop out the top. Ideally, what would then happen is that these gases would come out the knockout drum, and then they would be diverted into a flare gas recovery compressor. That compressor then takes those gases and sends it into the fuel gas system at the refinery, and that can be used in units like heaters, boilers, cogen units. It's a sort of a recycling of the gas. And that's the ideal case. In some cases, what happens though is that for whatever reason, those gases either are overpressured or they can't get their way through the flare gas recovery system, and then they are diverted through what's called a liquid seal, sometimes called a water seal, so that the gases will go into this. And this seal is really a way to separate the flare system itself from the gas recovery system, so that there isn't flow across these unless there's positive pressure on this side, so it's always flowing out through the stack. So then if there's overpressure for whatever reason, gases will move through the liquid seal, go up the flare tip, and then be combusted out at the top, what everybody sees. In addition, there's a few other things to note at the flare itself. In particular, there's often every time there's actually a steam line that comes in and the steam is injected at the flare tip itself. And the steam is used to help with that combustion process. And this is going to come up later. This is another feature of what we see with flares. Okay, so to think about the reasons why flaring is occurring, and again, this is after discussing this with the refineries, discussing this with our compliance staff. There's a number of reasons why you might have a planned flaring. So one is the flare gas recovery system. For example, the compressor size might not be big enough for that particular event, right? A compressor is only so big and can take only so much gas. If you have too much gas coming in at one time, it's going to have to be diverted into the flare. Secondly, maybe the flare gas can't actually be used as a fuel. Maybe for whatever reason it's not the right heat content or the heating value. When I say heating value, it's sort of are you able to actually combust that gas and use it for something productive? So for example, if you have natural gas that goes through your stove, you're used to that burning. If you send nitrogen through the same stove, you're not going to get any burning there, right? You need to have the right composition. So you need to have the flare gas that can be used as a fuel. There's a gas treatment system that's there. So for example, if there's some cleaning up of that gas that has to happen, sulfur might need to be removed or something like that, that there has to be a capability of the gas treatment system to handle the composition of that gas coming in and treat it. At the same time, this is kind of an important one too, the ability of the units in the facility, whether it's cogens, boilers, heaters, what have you, to accept the gas that's coming in at that time. And this is where timing is often critical. If you're shutting down a unit and starting up a unit, and that sequence doesn't quite work right, you might shut down a unit that's a consumer, while at the same time you have a producer, and so you don't have a place to actually send the gas. The gas has to go somewhere. It's too much to actually store in a tank. It has to go somewhere, so it either goes to a place where it can be consumed, or it goes out the flare tip. And again, this gets again to the timing of the startup and the shutdown of individual gas producers and consumers. Part of this gets to the time that it takes to start up or shut down individual units. That will also affect the timing. And what we've also been hearing from some refineries, and this is sometimes a little more nebulous, but it's just the general management practices of a refinery during turnarounds or startups and shutdowns. They know their equipment, they know what their processes and procedures are and ways to try to minimize flaring, and this is another important factor. What I think you're hearing part of this is that it's pretty clear that every refinery, these are not a simple process, they're quite complicated. And there's a lot of unique characteristics that really are affecting planned and unplanned flaring too, quite honestly. And you know, there's a lot of technical, operational, cost, and timing considerations that goes into flaring, and it's not a 1+1 kind of relationship. So what we're proposing is that facilities, they know their refineries best, they know their facilities best, that they prepare a scoping document to us that outlines what is needed to get to this goal of 0 planned flaring events, right? That they'll know their facility best, and it seems that they'd be able to define that best for themselves. But really, I think what we're looking at is to set some targets of what we want in this scoping document. So for example, we had said that we'd be splitting the planned versus unplanned flaring. So as an example, we might set some multiple targets that we would like to see in the scoping document of maybe 0.1 tons per million barrels of SOx. Remember, the overall target right now is 0.5 for all flaring. So maybe it's 0.1 tons for planned events, or 0.05, or down to 0, right? And to take a look and see what it would take for each refinery to get to this point over some specified time frame, for example, 5 years. We did take a look at, over the last 5 years, for each of the major refineries in the district, how many times have they actually hit these targets of the 0.1 and the 0.25 or the 0.05. And so you see this table down here on the right is showing for each refinery how many times in the last 5 years they've actually hit down to these various levels on just the planned flaring. And just for simplicity's sake, and it's not necessarily what would happen in the rule, but for simplicity's sake, we lumped all essential operational need into the planned flaring for this particular table. The emissions, that's a good question about where are the emissions measured. I'm going to get to that in a bit. I'm sorry? The emissions are measured, I'll get to the details of how they're measured, that's a big part of it, but facilities report quarterly their emissions to us and then annually as well. Okay? Quick question? Flaring can occur minutes, hours, longer for some extreme events, so it really fluctuates. Not typical, but there are rare events that could potentially happen. Again, knowing that there's a lot of sort of specific, unique characteristics to every facility, we think that there is probably a role also for an independent third-party expert that the district would hire to help review some of these scoping documents. There might be business confidential information that will be critical in this, and then there might be a good reason to have a third-party consultant to help with that and to also just understand the specifics of refinery processes. All right. I'm going to transition now into sort of a different part of the presentation, talking about the EPA regulations that govern flaring. And in particular, the EPA refinery sector rule was amended in 2015. There was a major amendment in 2015. There are some other minor amendments that are currently were initiated in 2016, but the major amendment was in 2015. And I should say that that total amendment, it governs a lot of different processes at refineries. It's maybe 300 pages of regulation total in the EPA requirements. Flaring is about 40 pages of that regulation. Most of it is contained in the section you see here, section 63.670 and 671 of subpart CC, in case anybody's really interested in getting into the weeds on this. And really what our goal is to include all flaring requirements into our rule, into Rule 1118 or the 1118 implementation guidance that goes along with the rule. And the idea is that there's kind of a one-stop shop, that you can find all the requirements in one single spot. You aren't having to go here and go here and go here. So it's easier for industry, easier for us for compliance. But certainly we recognize that 1118 cannot be any less stringent than the EPA, especially in that circumstance where everything is in one spot. Over the next several slides, I'm going to get into a lot of detail on this, and I apologize if your eyes are going to glass over for some of this, but we need to go through this for the thinking about how to craft specific rule language. This is sort of the high-level comparison of looking at the EPA refinery sector rule, what are the main components of it, and how does it relate to our rule. So we see each of the main components here in either rule. We walked through some detail at the last working group, what's specifically in 1118. I'm not going to rehash all of that. If folks are interested, we have the existing rule out on the table if you wanted to read our current regulation. But just briefly, 1118 currently has performance targets, which I've touched on a little bit, flare minimization plans, sulfur monitoring within the stack itself or within the gas system itself, public notification requirements, quarterly reporting. All of these are things that are in the Rule 1118 that are not in the federal requirements at all. So these are extra things that are in 1118 currently. We're roughly the same as what the EPA is requiring on pilot flames, flare gas composition and monitoring, and for record keeping. There's broadly similar. The devil's in the details on some of those, but we're broadly similar on those requirements. Where it gets a little different, what EPA has proposed recently, they have some new test methods. They have what's called a flare management plan. Unfortunately, that's an FMP, the same way we have a flare minimization plan, which is an FMP, and they are not at all similar. So I'll walk through the differences of those in a second. They have a root cause analysis, which is very similar to our specific cause analysis. There's some new violations in the EPA rule, and there are some flare operating limits and flare monitoring requirements that are a little different. Okay. With that, the structure of all these next several slides has this table at the top. I'm only going to cover sort of the two left columns in the table, and then there's a lot of detail over there on the right that folks who have questions about, feel free to ask, or it's just there to provide some of this background of what's actually required in the EPA rule. And really this is looking at the main portions of the EPA rule that are above and beyond air district requirements or just completely different from air district requirements. There's other things in there that I didn't want to duplicate everything that we already have. So specifically this flare management plan. So what this requires, what EPA requires is that by 2019, January 30, 2019, refineries must, throughout the nation, must prepare and implement a flare management plan. And this plan must show how they plan to minimize flaring during startups, shutdowns, and during emergencies, right? There's a series of elements that need to be in that plan. This is actually fairly similar to what the Air District did almost a decade ago, when the last time we amended Rule 1118, that we had a similar requirement. We didn't call it a flare management plan, but we had a similar requirement in our provision C3 of our rule that was evaluating options to reduce flaring. Right, so it's a very similar kind of provision. Refineries all submitted those plans in 2007, and a lot of what was taken from those plans was implemented at the time, including installing new flare gas recovery systems or components of flare gas recovery systems. And so a lot of that was already done about a decade ago. I do want to mention here the flare minimization plans. Those are different. So this flare minimization plan under 1118, this is triggered anytime a facility exceeds its annual performance target. And what this does is if a refinery exceeds its annual performance target of 0.5 tons per million barrels, they need to prepare a plan and provide it to the district showing how they are not going to exceed it next year. So for example, maybe there is an exceedance because something happened, right? An emergency happened at a refinery, some valve broke and it caused a lot of flaring. The flare minimization plan often would be, here's how the valve is not going to break in the future, we fixed it, and that's not going to happen again. That's a typical structure of a flare minimization plan. Moving to a different component of the EPA rule, this root cause analysis and a corrective action analysis. This is very similar to the Air District's specific cause analysis. The criteria is a little different though. For EPA, they have a criteria that's based on visibility limits or on flare tip velocity. And this is, the flare tip velocity, the idea of how much gas and how fast is the gas going through the flare tip. And if there's exceedances on those criteria, then a root cause analysis is required under the EPA rule. For the Air District, our thresholds are actually based on emissions. If the emissions are too high, above a threshold, or if the flow rate is exceeded, then that's our criteria. The timing is fairly similar for the EPA rule. There's a hard deadline of 45 days to submit the root cause analysis, including the corrective action. For Rule 1118, it's a 30-day requirement, but there's also a 30-day extension that's allowed. The violations, this is actually a pretty key provision of the EPA rule that I want to walk through. It's sort of, I like to think of it, or I like to, the word that always comes to mind is a 3 strikes rule. And the idea is that if there is a flaring event that is caused by poor operator or poor maintenance or operator error, that would be a violation. That's actually fairly similar to what Rule 1118 currently does. But beyond that, if there is a second exceedance, and that exceedance occurs within a 3-year window, and that exceedance has a root cause that is the same cause as the first event, then that would also be a violation. I should stop here and say, well, what is a flaring event under this violation? A flaring event is generally a smoking flaring event where the flare is smoking and the visibility limits are exceeded in the rule, or the velocity, again, the flare tip velocity limits are exceeded in the rule. That's a criteria. And that's generally averaged over a 15-minute average, typically. So if those kinds of events happen 2 in any 3 years for the same cause, that would be a violation. The 3rd strike provision would be 3 for any cause, again, with that same criteria of smoking or flare tip velocity and visibility limit violations. 3 of those in any 3-year period for any underlying root cause, that would also be a violation under the EPA rule. Their district doesn't really have anything like that currently under Rule 1118. I should kind of point out the visibility exceedances are fairly similar in 1118 and in the EPA refinery rule. We actually also have a different rule called Rule 401. This has its own visibility limits in it that are a little different. So instead of looking for visible emissions that are 5 minutes over a 2-hour consecutive period, it's instead looking at 3 minutes over 1 hour, but it has a different criteria. It has to at least be 20% opacity as opposed to IC emissions. So it's slightly different criteria, but it will make a difference when we think about crafting the rule. Okay. On flare operating limits, there's really a couple main differences here. One of the things that we touched on in the last working group was this idea of flare destruction efficiency. How well is the flare actually combusting the gases that are going through it? And there's a lot of focus in the EPA rule on ensuring very good combustion at the flare tip itself so that the gases that are going through are actually combusted and you aren't getting as many VOCs or volatile organic compounds after the flare. And so there are a couple provisions for this. One is the flare tip velocity, that there can't be exceedances over certain limits. And the idea is that if you're blowing product too fast out of the flare, it doesn't have time to go through the full combustion. And the second provision is, again, on the net heating value, and the idea is that if the gases coming through don't have the right heating value, if the heating value is too low, maybe it won't burn. If it's too high, maybe it burns too hot and it doesn't get complete combustion. And it's trying to make sure that it's, the main point is to make sure it's not too low So there's a variety of equations that are in there and conditions that are in the EPA rule to ensure that the heating value isn't too low. Currently, the Air District has no requirements similar to this in Rule 1118. There's also some monitoring requirements that kind of go to the same points that I just talked about of ensuring good combustion at the flare tip. Really the main differences on this, on looking on visibility, they have some requirements on you can do some physical observation of someone standing out there and watching for visible emissions, but the other way is also for video recording. The only difference really there is to look at a 1 frame every 15 seconds. Currently our rule says 1 frame every minute. So a small difference there. The other piece of this is to do monitoring of the flare itself. And when we say monitoring of the flare, this is of before the combustion zone, of looking at what's happening as the gases flow through the flare gas system, but not monitoring of the gases after they leave the flare gas system or leave the flare tip itself. So looking at the steam going in, looking at the vent gas that's going in, and monitoring how fast it's going through, what its composition is, how much steam is going through. The main difference here is on steam. The Air District, we don't currently have any provisions for steam monitoring in flare gas systems. We also don't have anything for air. Sometimes air assist is used in the same way that steam would be used at the flare tip, but we aren't aware of any air assist flares within the Air District. That's other parts of the nation. Big long table here on a continuous parameter monitoring system, a CPMS. This is really just the requirements of when doing monitoring of a flare system and looking at within the flare system itself, of measuring the flow, measuring the gas composition, measuring the steam, et cetera. How does that monitoring equipment actually work? What are the calibration requirements and all that? So there's a lot of detail in the rule on ensuring that there's a plan in place, that it's operated correctly, and that they have this, in some ways, an unfortunate term of calling it out-of-control periods. This is really where if the monitoring system is not operating within parameters, it has to be corrected, right? So there's a lot of very similar provisions currently in Rule 1118. The continuous parameter monitoring system plan under the EPA rule is due in January 2019. We had a very similar plan that was already required back in 2006. There'll have to be some updates to that again based on steam. The operational requirements are similar, but there's one key difference here. Rule 1118 requires 1-minute averages, for example, for flow monitoring, whereas the EPA rule is using 15-minute block averages. Flares can be kind of dynamic, so that could present a difference. The out-of-control periods and what to do, how to correct any issues with the monitoring system, that's pretty similar. Again, the steam would be something new. Okay, so I've gone through a lot of that. Some key takeaways that we have from looking at the refinery sector rule from EPA. There's a lot of new things in there. Again, there's prohibitions on smoking flaring events and some requirements to prevent smoking flaring. There's a lot of really good provisions in there. We do note that there's a significant amount of emissions that come out of flares when it's not smoking, right? So they're really focusing a lot on the smoking flaring, but there's not a whole lot that they have necessarily on the non-smoking flaring. There's a 3-year window of prohibitions. Again, this sort of 3 strikes provision that I talked about that uses a 3-year window to look at the second strike or the third strike. But what can happen is as long as maybe there's flaring that occurs year 1 and year 2 and year 3.5, then there might not be any permanent reductions that would occur. For example, turnarounds sometimes are a 4 or 5 year schedule, and so the 3-year window might not necessarily get at permanent emission reductions. There are these new monitoring requirements for combustion zone heating value, and again, this is to try to make sure that when flaring occurs, that it occurs the most efficient way possible, and that there's the most destruction possible of the gases. That's all really good. But we do note that there's not really any direct observation of the emissions themselves, and I'll get into this point in a little bit. And I mentioned already the 15-minute averages, that maybe a more granular look, that flares are sometimes a very dynamic system, and that the 15-minute average might sort of average maybe a little bit too much into it. Okay, I'm going to switch topics again. We're getting towards the end of the presentation, I promise. So this remote sensing pilot program, The idea for this is really to try to accurately determine the emissions that are coming out of a flare. The primary focus really will be on volatile organic compounds, VOCs, and to try to make sure we have a good understanding of what's happening from the emissions basis. And it's also to help the facilities know what the flare destruction efficiency is, so that maybe they can tune what they're doing at the time to really ensure that there's efficient combustion occurring at the flare tip. The idea behind this is to look at multiple remote sensing technologies. There's several different emerging technologies that are out there, and to test this out at actual refineries, see what they know about it, and see what their experiences are through this pilot program. We need to understand the logistics, the cost, the quality of the data. Can it actually be used in a regulatory program at this stage or not? The idea would be that we collect all this data, prepare a final report, and that final report would help inform what would happen during the second phase of this rule amendment as we go, in 2018, 2019 timeframe for that second phase. But really, the emissions data that would be collected during this pilot program would not necessarily be meant for compliance purposes. This is a little bit more of a science study to make sure that we're comfortable with the technology before we move forward with a compliance program. And then I covered this last part already. Part of the reason that we're looking at this destruction efficiency, EPA, as I mentioned, did a lot of work looking at destruction efficiency, and they found some reasons why they needed to amend their rule to make sure that there is good destruction efficiency. So there's a lot of science that they did over the last several years to look at this. There's a lot of new monitoring technologies that are becoming available to measure emissions, and it's really the idea is to be able to, in a very, very simple sense, if there's a flare that's located, kind of far away, to be able to set up some sort of camera or sensor farther away to be able to just look at the flare tip and to understand what's happening on the emissions side. Currently, all of our flare monitoring requirements are within the flare gas system. This would be able to look from far away. We have been, as the Air District, we funded some studies recently. Some of these were presented recently to our Stationary Source Committee that have looked at different kinds of technologies. Some of these optical remote sensing technologies, there's a lot of different kinds that are out there. This study looked at a few different a small subset of that. In particular, the study that was done at the time was a mobile study where you could have a van that would actually drive around and sense and detect the volatile organic compounds on the fence line of a facility, just to try and see how that would work. During one of the periods that they were doing this monitoring at one particular refinery, they actually caught a flaring event. This particular flaring event was a planned event. The district was notified about it ahead of time. It didn't particularly stand out for any reason. This is one planned flaring event among many. And so for this event, the facility reported correctly to us, based on our rule, 244 pounds of emissions. And this was all correctly reported. I don't think we had any concerns about this particular event for how it was reported to us. As we mentioned at the last working group, EPA updated their emission factor for flaring, especially for VOCs. There's about a 10-fold difference, a little bit more than that, from their old guidance to the new guidance. So using the new guidance that just came out late last year, that 10-fold difference goes from 244 pounds to a little bit more than 2,500 pounds for the same event, the same flow, and all that. It's just a different way of assessing the emissions. What we noticed in the study that we funded was for the observations that occurred over a 4-hour period. There's 8 observations over a 4-hour period. Each observation is about a minute long, give or take. And looking at the flare at that particular time over that 4-hour period, looking at a subset of VOCs, a major subset, it's called non-methane alkanes. It's a certain class of VOCs. It was about almost 6,400 pounds of emissions over that 4-hour period. There's a lot of error on that estimate of 6,400 plus or minus 4,000-ish. So at the very low end, if we subtract 4,100 from 6,355 over there, you get fairly similar to this 2,556 from the EPA estimate. But again, if you add, right, there's a lot of error in this. We aren't really sure how precise that number is. I think all this is telling us is that there's something going on, right? That there's more that we need to know about the VOC emissions that are occurring when flaring occurs. And this is, again, kind of not an atypical event for flaring. I've covered some of this already. One of the challenges out there with looking at flare monitoring is it's essentially impractical to stick, if we look at a flare system over here, to put some sort of monitoring equipment right here at the tip of the flare. You have a very hot flame right there. Anything you put there would be destroyed, and it's 100 feet plus in the air. It's pretty impractical to monitor it that way. But if there are ways to look using some of this optical remote sensing, and the idea is to look and see different wavelengths of light behave differently as they go through different compositions of air, and to try to tease out that signal. There's a lot of different ways to do that, but to see the different technologies that are out there, that's what we want to explore, to be able to have some remote system that will be able to monitor a flare. And there's maybe different ways to look at it. Maybe it will be looking at the actual specific composition. Maybe instead it would just be monitoring the destruction efficiency itself. We have a lot of information from within the flare gas system as far as heating value and composition of the fuels, and the flow rates. We actually do know a lot about what's going in. It's just once it gets through that flame, what's happening. So that's the idea, is to find some information to help with that. I think that the other point that's important here is that some of these technologies, should they prove to work for this kind of purpose, they actually can provide real-time data, and that real-time data can actually be very valuable. Currently, we get quarterly reporting, that every quarter facilities report their emissions to us, and it's very useful data, but again, to have that real-time data can actually be an extra benefit. Okay, the last main topic I want to cover here, looking at the mitigation fees. So again, I mentioned this before, there's a performance target within 1118. If that target is exceeded, and if it's exceeded at certain levels, there's a mitigation fee that's paid. So for example, if the 0.5 tons per million barrels is exceeded by up to 10%, there's a $25,000 per ton of SOx fee that's assessed. That moves up to $50,000 a ton if you're between 10 and 20%, and if you're over 20%, it's $100,000 a ton. Every year, there's an annual $4 million cap per facility. That's the current structure of the rule. Currently, facilities have an alternative feasible compliance option. They could not flare, and by not flaring, they will not have to pay this fee, or at least if they don't flare above the threshold. And also, another part of this is that if there are events that occur outside of the control of the facility, then they also don't have to pay fees on that. So for example, a natural disaster like an earthquake and power curtailments currently are in that category. I'm sorry, not power curtailments, power outages. So what we're thinking of looking at here on the mitigation fees, I mean, we do recognize that these mitigation fees, they are a disincentive for flaring, right? But beyond that, they also provide some funding to mitigate the emissions impact in the communities where these emissions are occurring. I mentioned before this idea of an alternative feasible compliance option. We plan to continue with that concept that there needs to be an alternative option to not pay a fee, that there has to be some way that a facility could not flare in a certain circumstance. And so we are continuing to pursue that. Part of the reason that we're pursuing this two-phase approach to the rule is to make sure that we have this idea of what is and is not feasible. And so this is why we're asking for a scoping document and a kind of a detailed scoping document to help us assess the feasibility of getting to zero planned flaring or getting down towards that goal. And the second phase of this rule amendment will really be taking the information from that scoping document and then incorporating that into the rule after we assess what comes out of those scoping documents themselves. And again, this alternative feasible compliance option is a key part of that. The one thing we are proposing to do right now on the current rule, that I mentioned this $4 million annual cap, we are proposing to remove that right now in the current phase one, the initial part of this rule. And the reason for that is it's only been exceeded by a single facility over the 10-year period that this fee has been in place. And so if all other facilities have found it feasible to not have to pay or not have to hit this cap, we think that there is alternative compliance that's available. And the other piece of this is that if there are emissions that are exceeding a certain amount, that there's still a need to mitigate those emissions. So the cap, to us, it makes sense to remove that cap. Okay, for next steps, we do plan to take a lot of these concepts as well as everything that we're going to hear from you all tonight. This is what we're presenting to you all now. We definitely want to hear feedback, and it's whether it's tonight or later on as you think about this more, feel free to send in emails or questions or comments over the phone. But we will be drafting some amended rule language. We'll be holding additional working group meetings. We're shooting for another one in about a month in the Wilmington area. We'll be sending out some notices to folks about the time and location of that. We are planning for a public workshop in May and then taking this to our governing board this summer. And with that, 2 staff contacts here on this last slide for Dairo and Eugene. And with that, I will stop and open this up for questions and comments.
Yes, my name is, is this okay the way it is?
Did you do introductions earlier? Maybe we should do introductions so you know who's sitting here, and some of us came in late.
Sorry.
I mean, you could just wait. It won't take us long. So my name's Philip Fine. I'm the Deputy Executive Officer at South Coast SCAQMD in the Planning and Rules Division. And we'll just let you know who's at the front table, so go ahead.
Okay. Susan Nakamura, Acting Assistant Deputy Executive Officer in Planning and Rules.
Daphne Sue, I'm an attorney with the SCAQMD.
And Ian probably introduced himself. I just want to say before we get started with comments, this is a working group meeting. It's not an official public workshop. It's not a hearing. This is interactive, so don't feel like you have limited time. You know, we want to hear from you. We want to get in conversations, hear your concerns. So this, even though we have it seems like a hearing because we have a mic up there. Typically, if we did this at the district, it would be a round table, and we'd be like discussing it kind of in a conversational way. So feel free to ask questions and get in a conversation, and everyone will have plenty of time to talk. So if you want to start with comments. Did you want to call these first?
Yeah. So we do have some speaker cards. So I think we'll go through these speaker cards, but as we get through these, if people want to continue conversation after that, that's fine. But since people filled these out, we'll go through the order that we got them. Anthony K. Churg? Oh, I'm sorry, it's you. Great, perfect.
All right. I guess I was really not aware how you determine the numbers that you have in the documents you show online. But it seems to me that these are mostly inferences based on what's going into the flare. Is that it? Are most of your charts and things based on that and not on actual measurements? And now you're talking about doing measurements in, beyond the fence line and in the flare. Is that the idea here?
Sure. So most of what's reported right now by facilities, they collect information from within the flare itself, as you described. What's then applied is something called an emission factor. And an emission factor is a way to translate what you see going in into what actually comes out as it goes through the combustion process. That emission factor has been based on measurements in the past. The emission factor that's currently in our rule is based on information from a few decades ago, and there's more data that's come out since then. And so I think the idea is to update that emission factor first with what EPA has provided. That's about that tenfold difference. But then to continue to understand what's happening at flaring events. And so rather than rely on a single number that's just translating what's happening inside to what's happening outside, to actually directly measure it. I think that's what we're trying to get at.
Okay, so the numbers may be much larger, as you indicated now in this presentation. They may be as much as tenfold as large as what the rules are calibrated for. The rules are calibrated for, half a ton per million barrels a year. So, it may be even worse.
I do want to pause really quick right there to make sure that this is something I didn't explain, but I think it's important to what you're talking about. The half ton per million barrels is SOx emissions,
Yeah.
Whereas what I was presenting before about the tenfold difference was on volatile organic compounds. There's reason to believe that the VOCs might be underreported where the SOx might not be. We actually directly measure sulfur in the system itself. The sulfur goes in, the sulfur comes out. There's not as much conversion and as much chemistry that's happening there as what would be happening with volatile organic compounds. So there's reason to believe that there might be differences on the SOx, which has the performance targets tied to it, versus the VOCs.
Okay, all right, I'll take that, all right. But the thing that really struck me I can't read off the whole URL for it, but you had this one paper posted online, I think for the February 28th presentation, that had these phenomenal emissions by the Torrance refinery. And it seems to me it was just so striking, two things. One is how they correlate with the mechanical instability of that plant and the number of breakdowns, the finding by the Chemical Safety Board that poor maintenance contributed to the 2015 accident. And the community is, both suffering from the emissions and expecting a major catastrophe. And it seems to me that the data that you already have show extreme mechanical instability for that refinery. And there ought to be a way that you can act on that. I don't know if it's ex post facto or what.
So it is absolutely true. If you look at the emissions numbers, that the Torrance refinery is much higher than the other ones. Some of that came from events that we've all heard of recently, some of these power outages that have occurred. And as Ian probably mentioned in last working group, they're under an order from our hearing board to work towards shoring up their power systems such that those types of events won't happen in the future.
Right, and that shoring up, based on Mr. Mayor's statement, was based on using the AES plant, which is non-existent. He said in the hearing there that they would be using the AES plant for their second source, and that AES plant doesn't even exist anymore.
Well, we're working on this. Edison is working on it. The refinery is working on it. So I think there are some solutions to this power issues that they've had recently.
Yeah.
They won't get rid of everything. So the other point to make is, because not everything was due to a power outage, this is one of the reasons we're opening this rule. We're trying to, update the rule for the EPA reg, but we're also looking at how we can move towards much less flaring from all the facilities, including Torrance. So some of the findings we've had in this city over the last couple years is one of the reasons we're trying to look at this rule again and see how we can solve a lot of those problems.
Well, I'm a scientist. I'm not a lawyer. I can't help you with the rule, but I can help you with the chart. That chart was the emissions by Torrance. You wrote the numbers in the paper there, in the PowerPoint, and they're bigger than the numbers that the chart could show. The chart can't show 487, it goes to 200. Right. The chart can't show 1,700%, it only goes to 600%. It underestimates the horror of this refinery, and the community is really up in arms. I wish we were. Maybe we could get something. We're very exasperated that this continues, and the risk is there, especially with the HF.
We understand. I'll disagree with you on one thing. Just because you're a scientist doesn't mean you can't help us with the rule. You're looking at several scientists up here and one lawyer.
I'll defer to everybody here on that.
Thank you for that. Next is Elaine Wilson.
First, I'd like to say what I've said before. I have tremendous respect for you and for the frustration you might and must continually feel from the forces now from outside this area in federal government, the planning to slash and already removing EPA employees. And so I look at what you have put together with reasonableness and the wiggle room that is continually provided to especially this refinery and especially locally. So I have empathy for you, and I, as well as many, many community members, are concerned, and many are afraid. I live on the fence line. I see the particulates. I used to see more, but I have plastic on the inside of my windows. I know with my particulate monitor the horror of the continual barrage. Spikes are bad enough, but continual barrage of particulates to children and seniors, as I am, are extremely, extremely dangerous. I have a military chemical monitor inside my home. And I will find out, and it's an amazing resource. I had to pay for it myself, $900. Nobody's replenishing my pocketbook. And I will find out on that carbon filter what has been collected inside my home. And as far as vans checking the fence line, that's not new technology. It is being used in Asia. I had a company come to my home and explain the technology to me. There are fence line monitors for each chemical. There's a separate part of the monitor. These exist. But when you have a refinery, and I'm going to quote, electrical upgrade of refinery, quote, the upgrade won't be quick. It could take up to 2.5 years to build the new electrical equipment, but the full transfer over to the new power line is a complex task that might not be completed in up to 9 years. And this refinery reliability manager, Meyer Sneer, said this. The cost could be tens of millions of dollars, perhaps more than 50 million, Sneer told the AQMD hearing board. That would have frustrated the heck out of me, because there's the wiggle room. There's the we can't do it. This is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Has anybody looked at the stock market lately? I will be presenting a 45 pages of Securities and Exchange Commission, all of the investors into this local refinery. Oh, they're so poor. Oh, they're only multi-billion dollars. But look at the investors. I believe Chase now has 10% ownership. So I empathize. I see the wiggle room. It's up there. And I saw what they said to you in your face, just as they smeared the Chemical Safety Board when they were Exxon. So I just want to say, you're doing work, and it has to be difficult. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if Ian mentioned this when he started, but just so everyone knows, and many of you are familiar, this is one of several rules that are either will affect refineries significantly or are specific for refineries that we're working on. This is addressing flaring in particular. We're also working on a rule that's going to look at potentially requiring fence line and community monitoring at every refinery. We're also looking at a rule to phase out HF. I think everyone in the room knows about that. And then we also are looking at our reclaim program and the NOx emissions, and what our board adopted earlier this month is going to require the facilities likely to put on a lot more controls for NOx as well. So there's quite a few things going on, and this is specific to one of those rules, but many of you are going to be participating in all those working groups and all those processes, so just keep that in mind.
You want to mention the April 1 meeting? I didn't mention that.
Yeah, I was going to do that at the end, but I'll do it multiple times. There's an April 1st meeting at the Marriott, I believe, in Torrance, where a subcommittee of our governing board, the refinery committee, is going to be holding an investigative hearing. I'm sure many of you know about it and will be there, looking at specifically the Torrance refinery and all the issues that have come up with the Torrance refinery across all the different issues. And there will be panels that involve state agencies, federal agencies, community members, elected officials, us. There's a wide variety. I think the agenda might have been posted today. If not today, it'll be up tomorrow. So if anyone has any questions on that, we can hope to answer them. It's still evolving a little bit.
Great. Jim Stewart?
Hi, I'm Jim Stewart, resident of West Long Beach, and this is really pretty scary stuff, all these emissions, but we really appreciate the fact that you guys are working hard on it, and it helps a lot. One of the things that Ian didn't mention at all, what are the health dangers of these? And of course, now we have 2/3 of the health dangers are coming from these unplanned events, and I have a picture of an unplanned flare event that I took out my bedroom window of the Tesoro refinery, and it looks like a heck of a lot of particulates, but you didn't mention anything about particulates. Could you talk a little bit about, I mean, you talked about SOx, you talked about VOCs, and ROGs are the same. What's going on with the particulates?
Sure. Particulates are actually required to be reported by facilities as well. I think that in many ways there are challenges in measuring the particulates coming out of a stack as well, and I think that we're
Wait a minute. You
as
can
far as
measure
as far as
things with, you
quantitative.
can measure opacity.
Sure, but getting from opacity into concentration is sometimes difficult. We have done some studies in the past of trying to do community monitoring during flaring events. It's hard to get that timing right always. So it's certainly, you're right, it's an area that is important, and it's something that we're continuing to try to look at in a variety of ways.
So you're basically saying you don't have any data. I mean, you can see photographs like this around, but you don't have any data on the particulates. And the lady preceding me was talking about the fact that she's got particulates at her house.
So the technology to measure either directly the particulates coming off a smoking flare, and again, many flares don't have the visible
Yeah, a lot of
emissions.
them are
Right.
just deadly from the ROGs. They don't have these particulates.
So
right?
the technology to have something up there in that plume is not really available. We're looking at remote sensing ways to get at VOCs, maybe SOx, maybe down the line particulates. It's more difficult. The best we can do now is when these events happen and the big events, we get out in the community, we try to set up monitors. It's very difficult. Now we have some community sensors out there that'll help us determine some of it, and that is part of the goal of our Rule 1180 development. As we're talking about fence line and community monitoring, PM will be a part of that, so we have those in place when these things are happening.
Okay, so
That's
you
only
are going to put
yeah.
in the fence, well,
Yeah.
assuming this rule passes,
Yeah.
which is...
Not this rule, another rule, but
Yeah, the other rule passes. You will put in particulate fence line monitors.
fence line or community or both.
Great.
So that's good
Okay.
for exposure. It doesn't necessarily get to the emission rate or the total emissions of PM, but it will tell you something about exposure in the community. It's hard to do that quantification of amount of mass of PM emissions on that stack. You can do some rough estimates. You can use emission factors. It's more difficult. We're going to try through some of these pilot projects, but yeah.
Well, I would think that when you have particulates coming into the community that you're measuring on these fence line and community monitors, that gives you data. Can't
It
you
gives
use
you
that?
exposure data. It
Yeah,
doesn't
well, that's
give-
what we're concerned.
Exactly.
We're breathing that.
Right. It doesn't give you emissions data directly.
I think
Interesting.
two points on that. It gives you also exposure data where the monitors are, right? And
Right.
it's impossible to stick a monitor at every single house.
No.
It's, but the other piece of this is that one of the key parts of the EPA rule was to really try to ensure efficient combustion. And efficient combustion really gets to particulate matter. You get a lot of
in other
particulate
words,
matter.
if there was efficient combustion, you wouldn't see this plume?
Correct.
That's correct.
Oh, good.
So there's a lot of requirements to try to get to that.
let's fix it then. Can you fix it? I mean, the technology is available then for the efficient combustion?
I wouldn't say it's completely available.
Oh, come
There
on.
are some things that can be done to improve the situation. I don't think anybody could promise that it will never happen again.
But I will note that as part of the EPA rule, those types of events are now, where this 3-year window would be violations under many circumstances, which they aren't necessarily now. If it was beyond the control of the facility, it doesn't get counted in the emissions. If it was if it wasn't due to operator error, it's not a violation. But if we incorporate the new EPA requirements, those types of events, whether we, at least just based on EPA, if you have more than 1 or 2 or 3, depending on the root cause, those would just be violations in themselves, which isn't necessarily the case now. Now, in some cases, we might write a nuisance violation for something like that, but it's sometimes hard to prosecute that. The EPA rule is providing another layer of enforcement for those types of events, and we'll be considering in our rule if we're going to mirror that or go beyond it or figure out how to do that.
Let me just say, now this was an unplanned event because the lights in my house just flickered for an instant. I mean, the electricity was not off for a whole second, and this happened. So this is one of these stupid, power interruptions. And I say stupid because it should be possible to have some kind of backup system that would eliminate this kind of flare because the lights flicker for a half a second. What's going on the backup?
Yeah, and we've been digging into that issue deeply over the past several months and longer, and there are still some challenges, but we mentioned the order for abatement and the 9-year time frame. There are some measures that are going to go in place on a much faster time scale. It's not going to be the final solution for the power in Torrance, but there are some things they're going to do in the nearer term that will help the situation. But when I first looked at it, I looked at it as the technology seems. There should be technology.
I mean,
but
there's batteries, there's generators. I mean, everybody knows about backup power. Why are the refineries not putting it in?
Yeah. So what we learned is that there's not much off the shelf that's been implemented at these types of amperages and voltages that they use at refineries. It doesn't mean something couldn't be developed. It just those types of systems haven't been developed for whatever reason, and we'll be looking at that.
Well, all I can say is the community demands that. I mean, we're glad you're looking. We want that in that rule. I mean, we want the elimination of these unplanned events that are happening just because of a flicker of a light.
I should say that there are some facilities that do have cogeneration plants that produce steam and power on their facility. The size of those cogen plants varies for a lot of reasons, but that is
Can
one.
they use that power then to eliminate this crap?
It depends. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. It depends on a lot of things, but sometimes.
Okay, well.
Yeah. If you look at the data,
you know what we want.
Yeah. If you look at the data, a lot of the power issues are specific to the Torrance refinery. When you looked at
this one was Valero.
Yeah. There are some other ones, but if you look at the history, Torrance has had some more significant issues with their power supply. Some facilities who have a big cogen plant and feed that back into their plant have a lot less because they're more isolated from the grid.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Maureen Malk?
Hey everybody, thank you for having us and coming all the way out to Torrance tonight, especially. We appreciate you making the trip. I'm Maureen Mock. I live in the community and also co-founded an organization called FLARE, Families Lobbying Against Refinery Exposures. Almost exactly a year ago, with the refinery restart that happened and the AQMD hearing, order of abatement that happened last April. So here we are a year later. Thank you. A lot has happened. A lot has transpired, all ideally towards progress on the rulemaking side. But unfortunately, at the same time, a lot has happened on the refinery side. We have new ownership, a lot more issues, another explosion, another fire, protest march, threats of a counter-protest march, sinkholes, smells that have still been unidentified. A lot of issues, obviously, are still happening every day. So there's so many questions. I have some kind of detailed questions for you, but one top-of-the-mind question. When we get the alert from the Torrance alert system that is fed through the City of Torrance Police Department, ultimately, but a lot of communication comes from the refinery, and we receive the statement, no off-site impacts. What does that mean? And Chief Jemays is here too, so he could also chime in. But when we know that there's no way of reading this, and these are all just estimates, averages, the refinery managers are claiming that they're overestimates and totally incorrect anyway, what should the community read from that statement? Because we get it typically once every 2 weeks at this point after a major event. Anybody?
I think for the city alerts, it's probably a question better directed to the city about what's in that.
Okay, so city, this is round table here. We're all here for the same reason. What does no offsite impact mean to you?
That means that we have not determined that any of the products from the plant, based on the equipment that we have made it past the fence line in any detectable quantities.
So that's right, and I remember you telling me that the fire department does have their own trucks, and a few of them have some specific measuring equipment. Is it similar? What are we measuring? I remember you told me, honestly.
It's a myriad of chemicals that we measure, but we don't have the same resources nor the specific monitors that AQMD uses.
And then where those trucks are on site, ground zero essentially, and the stacks.
On-site and off-site.
So which way do you go? Do you go downwind, and how many miles when you measure with no offsite?
Generally, we just do outside the fence line because we don't find anything there. Generally, we don't find anything farther than past that. And then if it's on the other side of the fence, we have people that are co-located with the refinery folks to verify what they have as well. So unfortunately, all odors can't be measured. If I speak in that realm.
Odors, obviously, yeah.
All odors. So
But
the
we're not
odors that
talking
we've had-
odors, we're
the odors
talking-
that we've had don't result in any findings from any of the meters that we carry.
So we've got a fire truck on site and right off site on the premises, and we have the flare. I'm going to see your photo up over miles, smoke forever. Just kind of saying, so no off-site impact to us at this point means that 2 fire trucks that don't have great equipment can't find anything.
I can't say we don't have great equipment
That don't have as great of equipment as the air quality district.
because we're not the air quality.
Right. And the air quality district is an hour away and
Well,
running there to try to measure something
let me-
if they bring their truck.
Right, so let me
Right.
add a few things to that. I appreciate the shout out for our resources, but we have limited resources also.
And there's a summa canister. I know if we
Yeah.
beg and plead, sometimes we can get to the right person that sends a canister, but by
Right.
that time it's usually too late.
So-
And then
so-
we have to put a public information request, and a couple months later, we get the read as to what it was we were breathing 3 months
I understand. So this is one of those other things like we often do in rulemaking is ask for a little bit of patience. Where we received a lot of proposals for the supplemental environmental projects out of the 2.7 million. Many of you are aware that we have those projects, and we're getting close to finishing our evaluation, and I apologize for delays. There's been some reasons for that. We're going as fast as we can. But we're in receipt of many proposals that are proposing very extensive monitoring systems at the fence line and or in the community.
Right.
And most of those proposals have a component that data is going to feed into some kind of alert system. Now, we haven't made our recommendations to our board. Our board makes the final decision on which ones get funded. We're still in the evaluation stage, and we're crafting the results of that. It's going to come relatively soon. But again, your points are well taken, but there are
And
steps.
I was setting you up for that too, so you can talk
I
about
know.
all the good stuff.
Our,
you
our
got.
point, your point's well taken, but there are steps being taken
Yeah, I know.
to move, and I think where you're kind of asking for is to get those types of monitoring systems out there in place 24/7, such that those alerts that go out can be better informed by more robust data.
So yeah, so no offsite impact, that's what that means for now. Moving on. When Steve Steach and PBF, the refinery manager and team, says that their estimates on the SOX are way off, and apologizing that they seem so big, but that to totally disregard them, what do you guys say to that?
I did make a small mention of this, that we have received a request to revise those emission estimates. There are some cases, and it affects at every refinery, for example, maybe some of the monitoring equipment is down for whatever reason temporarily, and a flaring event occurs while the monitoring equipment is down. We have what are called data substitution procedures that are sort of a conservative estimate. If we don't have monitoring, well, we're going to use sort of a conservative end because we don't really know what it is,
Right.
and that conservative estimate is what gets submitted to us. There are sometimes ways to go back and try to refine that estimate, and as far as I'm aware, Torrance submitted a revised estimate for 2016, but I'm not aware of revisions pending for any prior year.
Okay.
And that's something we would have to evaluate just before we change those estimates.
Correct.
That's good to know. So, slide 21, when you were talking about the emerging technologies, and and which I know there's a lot of great stuff coming, and what they can do even with light and sound. It's amazing what we can kind of hopefully do coming down the pipeline here. And the beginning monitoring that sounds like would be implemented very soon would be just for science, just for the data, just for the experiment to see, not necessary for enforcement. Could, let's say, Torrance Refining Company refuse to participate, or would this be mandatory that they participate?
Well, there's one thing I want to be clear on. There's some technologies that Ian talked about in his presentation that were called remote sensing technologies. And these are ones that are designed to be focused on the tip of the flare to try to estimate emissions more accurately. And we've been talking about all the issues with estimating emissions. On the other side, we're talking about fence line monitoring and community monitoring. And there is some overlap in the type of technologies, but what we're talking about in this rule is requiring participation in some pilot studies for that emission estimation type of remote sensing. In our other rule, we're talking about requiring the type of fence line monitoring and perhaps alerting that we're already doing in Torrance for the supplemental environmental projects for some of the mitigation fees or the penalty fees. So that's there's a little bit of a difference there. Some of the technologies overlap, but this rule we're talking about not community monitoring, not fence line monitoring, but trying to better estimate what's coming out of the stack. And if we require in the rule participation in a pilot study on those types of equipment, they would be required to do so.
Okay, that's good. So right now, the refinery cannot be adequately monitored for smokeless emission given the AQMD's office locations and the requirement that the AQMD inspector visually has to confirm that black smoke. I would just like to suggest that we need some sort of rule within this process that allows for monitoring without an inspector's on-site visual inspection. The refinery monitors there should be refinery monitors with color video. This video or other monitoring equipment measuring the opacity should legally count. Right now, even if I submitted a time, date stamped video, it legally cannot be recorded as such to be enforced. And even though I believe that there are some black and white video monitors on the stacks at all times internally at the refinery, they cannot use their own video monitors as evidence against them.
Okay. Well, that's something we'll definitely be looking into as we go into the crafting the rule.
Smoke spotters, whether it's regional, local, an entire team trained with the opacity charts.
I do want to touch on that just a little bit. It doesn't completely get at what your comment is, and we'll take this back. But the EPA requirement, actually, there's observation of visible emissions as one part of the violations, but there's actually also a calculation. The general idea being that a flare can handle a certain hydraulic capacity, a certain amount of flow can go through a flare, but there's a lesser amount that would not cause smoking. And there's a way to calculate that based on the inputs and the gas flow and all that. And so they actually have violations that can be tied to not just the observation, but also tied to the calculation of should it be smoking because it's over its smoking capacity, right? So
Like if
it doesn't quite get at it.
If it was raining and they were still blowing a ton up, but you couldn't physically see the smoke, you're saying they could still be in violation.
Potentially.
for
So
example.
that
Like,
it doesn't
I
get
don't know.
completely at it, but there are some parts of it
That's
there.
interesting. Okay. I'm almost done. One thing I also wanted to mention is that the flare minimization plan should be including upgrades when it's submitted. We should not permit the refinery to claim that whatever events caused that overage were one-time events and therefore no upgrade necessary. and obviously should not allow refineries to submit the same flare minimization plan as the previous plan. I think that goes back to that 3 strikes EPA. It would also be interesting to see if we could have AQMD testing that 24-hour hotline when a flare event is reported. There should have a requirement that the line is manned by someone on site, not remotely, and that on-site person should keep a log of all calls and complaints, which is then submitted to the AQMD. I'm not talking about 24-hour AQMD hotline, I'm talking about the refinery hotline. Right now, you often will get, and many people have brought it to us, is calling the refinery, what's going on? They're routed to somebody like a call center in Texas where actually 2 different people said, the woman said, you should move. So, I mean, this is like what they're dealing with. But all of those should be logged. There should be somebody on site that actually knows picking up the phone. We shouldn't be getting busy signals or no pickup. You know, not everybody knows what the AQMD is to look to find it. They're going to go to their phone book. And finally, when the refinery engages in data substitution under the attachment B of the guidelines for calculating the flare emissions, AQMD should have the right to demand backup and source documentation.
We do,
You do?
already.
Excellent. All right. Finally, I just want to mention that there's a lot of stuff that's been happening right now on the back end of what the AQMD is doing on a state level with some lawmaking going into place, or at least being proposed. I know the LA County Board of Supervisors unanimously voted to support it about a week ago. City of Torrance is actually kind of digging their heels in and holding back more than could be expected considering all the people that live here, including the people that lead us. What could the City of Torrance, especially the leadership, be doing to better support the AQMD right now?
I mean, we're going to move forward with our rulemaking on all the fronts that we mentioned. We welcome the participation of the community. We welcome the participation of state and government agencies, elected officials, and Torrance. And I think as long as everyone's at the table, typically as we go through rulemaking, we take all that into account. Maybe not everyone's happy with everything, but we generally come out to some consensus, even including some of the affected facilities by the time we get to rulemaking. Mm-hmm. So whether the city supports exactly what we're doing or doesn't support, it's not really going to change, where we're headed, because we're guided by the science.
That's good.
However, in implementing some of it, we're always looking for partners to help us implement some of the things that we're coming up with. So we'd love the cooperation of the city in not just information gathering for rulemaking, but for cooperation on these monitoring projects that we're looking at, for future monitoring requirements, for a lot of different things that have to go around just the rulemaking. So obviously they have a presence here, and we want them to work with us to help these rules work, right? So.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Step up and cooperate. Thank you.
Okay.
The next card we have is Catherine Lays.
Hi, guys. I'm Catherine Lays. I'm the other half of Flair, Torrance resident. So I had just a couple notes when I went through last night, the document, and then just one question. So as far as the pass on things outside of the refinery's control, like power disruptions, I mean, I have the cause analysis for all the flarings from 2010 to 2016. I submitted at the February 15th hearing. There is a lot. I should have flagged them, of power disruption. So this is documented, and I got this through public information requests, just at least since 2010. So I would urge you to have that not be a pass. I think the clock should have been ticking on this order of abatement for a power solution. Clearly it can be done, right? 2.5 years for the equivalent of, I don't know, it sounds like a surge protector in layman's terms, and then 9 years for the full solution. So ideally, we should have started doing that a long time ago. So I would hope that the updated rule does not allow that to be a pass. And then I just wanted to clarify, did you say you were going to remove the cap for the $4 million or raise the cap?
We're proposing to remove it.
Awesome. Well, that's a very well-supported thing. And then I had a question on heavy metals. Does this rule take into account the type of crude that's being flared, and whether that type is more likely to have contaminants such as heavy metals?
In general, the crude material itself is not being flared. In general, it's the gases that are being flared as it goes through that knockout pot that I described at the beginning. That's supposed to separate the gases and the liquids.
Okay.
And so it's supposed to just be gases, which shouldn't really have a whole lot of metals in there, right? It's generally volatile organic compounds that are going through the flare itself. And so that the heavy metals might be in other parts of the refinery or other areas, but it shouldn't be necessarily going through the flare itself.
Okay, so, okay.
Does that make
'Cause
sense, what I just said?
Yeah, I was speaking with a big monitoring company, and they were talking about all the heavy metals. So I guess if that's something that you typically don't worry about in the flaring, that's
there's other equipment at refineries that may have some heavy metal emissions, and
Okay.
that's why when we're looking at the monitoring rule, that might be one thing that we want to include.
Okay,
But flaring typically is not the source of those heavy
gotcha.
metals.
So that's for the other rulemaking. Okay. And I just had a comment. I think that if the refinery fails to take action on a root cause after submitting a root cause analysis, it should generate additional fines. But I think, was that what you were getting at with the strikes? I came in a little bit late.
So they're currently in the current rule 1118. There's a specific cause analysis, in the same way there's a root cause analysis in the
Right.
EPA rule. Both of those have a requirement that the corrective action has been taken by the time they submit the specific cause analysis to us. So
Okay.
there's an expectation that the corrective action has already occurred by the time we get it. That's 30, 45 days time frame.
And then what happens if they do submit the same root cause, or are they usually smarter to not?
So
that.
under the EPA regulation, if it's 2 times that it's the same root cause within a 3-year window, meeting all the criteria,
Yeah.
then that would be a violation.
Got it. Okay.
If they fail to submit a root cause analysis, I think that's a violation, which could come with penalties.
Okay. And if they do, I'm sorry if I'm misunderstanding, if they submit the same root cause that wasn't potentially fixed?
Right, so it's, that's sort of the second strike.
Okay.
If it happens twice in a 3-year period,
That's a second, okay.
that's a violation. And if it's 3 times for any reason, meeting the criteria of smoking and velocity limits and all that, 3 times for any reason is also a violation in a 3-year period.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
These are in the EPA reg that exists now, not implemented yet, but, so those are things we'll be bringing into our rule.
Into your rule
Right.
one. Okay. And then I guess my last question, because this is part of Rule 1118, have the unmetered lines been capped as required under the settlement in 2014?
My understanding is yes. I'm not the expert on it, but when I've talked to district staff about this, yes, that's my understanding. But we could probably follow up at another meeting if somebody, or if there's other district staff that know that for sure.
Okay.
Encourage
Does the
them to
legal
chime in.
team
But my
know?
understanding is yes.
You don't, okay. Okay, thank you. That's all I got.
Tom Newman?
Yeah, Tom Newman. I'm a Torrance resident. I'm kind of new to this. I don't have all the technical jargon down. But I'm happy that you folks are out here. I'm happy that the city is represented, that the county is in on this, that Ted Lieu is in on this. Now, maybe you guys don't know, but at city council meeting, within the last month, they authorized the purchase of a drone for use by the police department. Maybe you could strap monitoring gear onto that, send it right to wherever you want it, so you're not stuck at the fence line, and it would be right here on site. Then there'd be no excuse, You could make sure it was working. I don't know how big your gear is, but we also have drones parked in other places in the South Bay. They're made here. The other thing is, okay, the 30%, approximate 30% outage is due to electrical fluctuations, minor glitches. That means 70% is engineering problems, equipment breakdown, human errors that you guys aren't responsible for. have no control over, but we're all the victims of that. And that's one of the reasons I guess people are concerned about the HF. Now, you can just park that away, but it's only 30% that is caused by electrical fluctuations. Now, when we do major shows here in town, like the Academy Awards, they have a backup generation system that automatically toggles from city power right over to generator power. I mean, with no glitch, because simply cannot afford to go black to New York. Maybe they ought to investigate what's happening in showbiz. I realize it's a whopping lot of power that's needed for the refinery, but they've got the computer programs to handle that glitch. The other thing is, you talked about a third-party consultant expert. Where do you go and get somebody like that? They come from within the industry? Or do you call up somebody like Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and say, who do you recommend? I mean, we've had those things before where we've had consultants who, you know, came out of the industry and, you know, paid themselves back somehow, or so it seemed. Anyway, I just wanted to point out, we do have drones, and Torrance has one. The idea is maybe to strap some of your sampling gear onto that and sending it wherever you want it.
I do just want to speak to the one point about a third-party consultant. I think it's the, we have used this in the past on other rulemaking. We found it useful and valuable. We like to make sure that the consultant is beholden to the contract that they have with us, right? And so we try to make sure that there's the expertise there, but it's that it's something that there's an extra expertise that would be provided by this consultant that would help with this rulemaking, but it would be that they are providing the service for us, not providing the service for the industry.
That is good, and let's hope that it happens, you know?
So at this point, that's all the cards we have, but certainly it's open to anybody to come forward and feel free to line up, or if there's any other comments or questions or anything, we're open. Yeah, come on up. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Oops. What did I do? Okay. I just have a question about, my concern is that the refineries could just drag their feet on these things, give excuses of why they can't do this, because it's going to cost them money, and they don't want to spend any money. And this concerns me, and it's not quite clear to me what kind of clout that the SCAQMD has to monitor what they're doing, and I want to say force them to do it. And especially with this power thing, to take 9 years is like ridiculous. So that's my question.
In terms of our authority, we have the authority to pass rules like the one we're talking about. We have an existing rule that addresses flaring, and we're now proposing to update that and try to reduce flaring even further. And if the facility doesn't comply with that rule, they're in violation of our rule. We issue them a violation, and then they're subject to penalties and fines. So in terms of dragging their feet, if our rule says by a certain date you have to do something and they don't do it, then they are subject to, you know, civil penalties. In terms of the 9 years, that was adjudicated by our hearing board. Daphne could probably talk in more detail, but that is an independent body. It's not part of our AQMD board. It's an independent body set up by state law that issues orders for abatement, and they hear all the evidence, and they issue an order, and they make that judicial judgment of what's feasible and what needs to be done, and that was done by our hearing board. And Daphne was part of that, so she can...
So in the part of the abatement proceedings, there is an abatement order against the Torrance refining company, and basically there are things that they need to do. For example, within 6 months, they're supposed to be looking at a temporary supply of steam for the flares, which would help reduce the smoking. So, and they're also looking at basically looking at if there's any other places where they could put a battery backup power supply for certain devices. They're also looking at utility system upgrades such as steam systems, nitrogen supplies. So there's other things in the order. And also looking at the 220 kV proposal, which is I think what you're talking about, that may take fully 9 years to implement. There's steps within that we're looking at. For example, how are they going to set up the supply within the refinery? So there are different things. In September, there will be a status hearing and possibly a modification of the abatement order. So that's in September, this September.
And a violation of an order like that is the same as a violation of one of our rules. So again, civil penalties could be.
Well, my concern is the refineries don't seem to care about paying penalties. The money doesn't mean anything to them when it comes to that kind of spending, but that when something needs to be done, they say it's going to cost them too much money. So I don't know if there's something worse you can do than issue a
Right.
penalty. I don't know if there's some other thing you can do that'll hurt them more so that they will
Right.
get off their feet
Well,
and do something.
in some cases, the penalties can be significant. That's one of the reasons removing the cap on the flaring is one thing we're looking
Yeah,
at.
that was great,
There was a
yeah.
settlement with a refinery many years ago, I think 12 or 13 years ago, for upwards of $80 million. I think that got their attention. So I'm not saying that's the situation here, but some of the penalties can be quite high, depending on the situation, depending how long it went on, depending on whether it was a willing or not, and those are done through the civil penalty process.
I want to mention too, I think it is worth mentioning, so the last rule amendment in 2005 for Rule 1118, that had a series of timelines, pretty aggressive timelines in there for refineries to install new controls, new vapor recovery systems to reduce flaring. And largely it was successful, that the amount of flaring that's occurring today versus when that last rule amendment occurred is much less, and the refineries all stepped up and did a lot to their facilities to reduce flaring. So we're trying to make sure that that happens again. This is the next stage.
Well, I know we're not here to talk about MHF, but what we're hearing from them is that they don't want to make the change because it's going to cost them too much money. So they're going to say to us, well, we've had to pay all these fines, and now we don't have enough money to do, so it's like, I don't know, it's like a revolving door.
Yeah, I mean, there's multiple rules, as I mentioned, that we're working on, all of which can add up to some costs for the refineries going forward. So again, when we do our rulemaking, not only do we come up with the rules, we also look at, and we're obligated to look at by state law, the socioeconomic impacts of the rule that we just adopted. So we look at the costs of the rule, we also look at the benefits of the rule, and we look at the effect on the regional economy of the rule. So all that data is disclosed to our governing board as they make a decision on whatever staff would propose. So it's part of the process. And the health benefits, yeah. So depending on the rule, like the monitoring rule, I'm not sure you're going to be able to quantify health benefit. You're going to get a lot of good information. Some rules go through the full analysis, some it's just not possible. But we look at all that, we disclose all that information, it's all public, and there's input on that information such that if you think we've done the calculation wrong or aren't considering something, we hear about it, and you should tell us about it, and we'll take that into account.
Anyone else?
Hello, I'm a resident of Torrance. I live within a mile of the refinery, to the west of the refinery, thank God. Sorry for you. I wanted to ask about the stacks for this flaring. Is it, when Exxon was there, they had one stack. When they blew everything up and they rebuilt that portion, they put two stacks there. And I wondered why. Sometimes it sounds like a freight train when both of them are going at once. And at first I couldn't figure out what it was because I'd hear this. I thought maybe it was a train going on 190th on the tracks that go over Hawthorne Boulevard. And it wasn't that, because it went on forever. So I opened the door of my sunroom, and it was coming directly from the refinery. So I called them up. In fact, it was on a Sunday night just recently. And I said, "What in the H are you doing over there?" I said, "I had to turn my TV up. It's almost 10 o'clock at night." Within 20 minutes, it was quiet. Now, I don't know what they were doing, but I was assuming it might be the flaring. Today, you'll have to use my low-tech way. There was black smoke coming out of the refinery, because I'm not close enough to the refinery to see the refinery, but I can see the smoke rising from there. There was black smoke coming up, and I quickly looked out the other window that faces Magruder Middle School, because they usually have their flag up, and I look and see, is it blowing east or west? If it's blowing east, I relax. Sorry about that. but that's ridiculous. You know, this is my low-tech way of protecting myself, because if it's blowing toward the west, like it was the day of the explosion, and everybody in West Torrance got involved who never paid attention to what was going on at the refinery prior to that time, but they're the ones that got all the ash and debris and everything else from the refinery that day. But I just wonder, why do they have to have two stacks? They had one before, and now all of a sudden they got two. So it's twice as much pollution coming out? I don't understand that.
Yeah, I'm not sure the specific history from switching from one flare to two flares and why that is. Unfortunately, I don't know that right now.
We'll look into it, and next working group meeting, we'll try to get you some information.
Yeah, I'd like to know about that, because I noticed that, and, but yeah, I appreciate that you're finally doing something about this, because we've been yelling about this for a long time, and I'm not very well liked by the refinery. I usually say things that agitate them, but I really don't care, because they agitate me too. So I'm so happy that you are doing something, and the tighter the rules, the better. I told Paul Penn that too, and I'm so glad that they're tightening up their rules as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
They've always had two flares. We didn't build
Oh,
it
they
out.
have?
It's just usually just one goes off. If it's really, really, really bad, then two go off.
Well,
Exactly.
it must be really, really bad, because most of the time there's two of them going.
Okay, go ahead.
I don't know, are they next to each other like that or what?
Hi, my name is Jamie Parek. I work with Communities for a Better Environment. I'm an attorney and the Vabank Law Foundation Fellow with Communities for a Better Environment. So I want to thank AQMD for the important work you're doing on updating this rule, and also want to thank the community for coming out and making your voice heard. Your voice is really powerful, and I encourage you to continue coming out and supporting presenting your viewpoints. I represent the neighbors of Wilmington and who live around 5 refineries in the harbor area. And CBE has been involved in developing the original flare regulations for many decades. We are here both to support the Torrance neighbors who have endured repeated flares recently, and also to support the district adopting standards for all refineries and other entities flaring in the region to reflect the best practices in the industry, not just standards that allow continued business as usual. We propose tighter annual performance standards of 0.1 tons of SOx per million barrels for all flaring events. We do not support the proposal allowing 0.25 for planned and an additional 0.25 for unplanned flaring. 0.1 tons of SOx per million barrels is the best practice in the industry and should be adopted. We also
Can I ask one question on that? Is
Yeah.
that all right? Round table, that's supposed to be. What about the idea of splitting planned and unplanned? Not that the total would increase, but we feel like the issues around unplanned are very different than the issues around planned. So if we can split those off, we might be able to address them in different ways. Is that something that sounds reasonable to?
You know,
Yeah.
I'm actually not the expert, so I'm going to
Okay.
take it back to our expert, but I will definitely take it back
Okay.
to Julia May, who's our scientist, and talk to her about it.
Okay.
But thank you for that.
Okay.
And then we also propose adding performance standards and fee collection for VOC emissions. You know, your figures confirm that hydrocarbon and hydrocarbon emission estimates are much higher than previously assessed. So there should also be annual tons per year limits and disincentives for hydrocarbon flaring. We're also very excited about this remote sensing monitoring of flaring and hope that it begins as soon as possible. There's a lot of evidence that flare destruction efficiencies of hydrocarbons goes far below 98.5%, and as the destruction efficiency goes down, emissions go drastically higher. So we're really supportive of this work. The one issue we didn't see addressed was the problem of oversteaming flares. Quenching the flame to some extent can reduce, helps with the flaring problem, but sometimes can drastically reduce destruction efficiency. And so the district should investigate this more.
Just want to touch on that point really quick. So the EPA rule actually specifically looks at that, and so they have requirements for the combustion zone heating value, and they set a limit there, a lower limit, and really that's trying to tackle too much steam or too much air going in.
I see.
So.
Okay, great, thank you. And then we also really appreciate the customized scoping plans for each refinery towards zero planned flaring. We would like these plans to also seek to minimize or eliminate unplanned flaring and also flaring for essential operational needs. We are very interested in preventing flaring due to power outages and would like to see much more detailed assessment of root cause analyses. We realize that flaring must be available for true emergencies, but not for repeated malfunctions. So the goal is to require that every flare event will have a root cause analysis. And so this, I think, kind of goes to what you were saying about the 3 violations. But just to continue to be strict on that. And then, as we talked about last time, there's no longer a reason to exempt methane in the regulations. Studies show that methane can substantially contribute to ground-level ozone formation in addition to being a potent greenhouse gas. We also reiterate our request to put flare data online for the public, as the Bay Area has already done. And we think about the additional expertise and the consultant. We think that's good to bring that on and to have someone with that expertise consulted by the district, but we also want to ensure that the district is retaining all those records and in the public record that can be subject to public records requests. And so with that, I would like to thank you all for the important work you're doing, and also just say that my associate Julia May cannot be here, but she's also available for input on these questions and will continue to be involved. Thank you so much.
Thank you. On making the information public, we try to do that as much as possible, but there is the issue of some of the refineries, there is some confidential business information, and they can make a claim of confidential business information, and if our lawyers determine that it is such, then that it can be withheld. And there's lots of reasons for that in terms of competitive advantage, but also antitrust issues amongst refineries. So as much as we possibly can, we do make public, but in some of these scoping documents or minimization plans, there could be some confidential information. So we might have to redact it or work with the facilities to try to get as much available as possible. Right. Yes.
Hi, my name is Sandy Cartier, and I had an idea which PETA would not like, but having canaries positioned at different altitudes, actually being sacrificed eventually to analyze their lungs. And really, I'm serious, and I love animals, but our child or your children are at risk. And schools apparently are under restrictions. They can't probably have monitors on site. But I think that would be the most significant location for most of the monitors. And not just during the event of a flare, but say 72 hours after, when that stuff finally settles out of the sky. That's what we're breathing for how many hours or days. And just that quantitation could be very important. And that if you can measure dioxin in the cellar of an old house, why can't you measure something as detrimental as the products coming out of a refinery? There's got to be a simple way.
So as I mentioned, there's efforts both through rulemaking and specific to Torrance to set up those types of systems.
Yeah, and also we have a resource in the South Bay who may actually help us out with this, and I'd like to approach him, but maybe you have more access to him, and that's Elon Musk. And if he can do what he's doing with SpaceX, he can probably solve this problem while he's in the bathroom.
Thank you. Anyone else like to speak?
Hi, Joanne Perez, longtime Torrance resident. Thank you, everybody who's come out and spoken and been here to listen. I just had a real quick question because I wasn't really clear on this. You talked about the flare tip velocity. I'm assuming that's not static, right? I mean, it changes. How is that measured?
Typically, the flare tip velocity is measured by looking at the gas flow going through the flare system itself, and by using the flow going through as well as the cross-sectional diameter of the flare tip, you can calculate it.
Anyone else like to speak? I think we have someone coming to the mic. I know this format isn't conducive to discussion, and it's seems like you're testifying. It's really not. And I think in future meetings we'll try to figure out a way that this is a little more interactive. So.
Hi, my name is Melissa Parra. I'm a Paramount resident. I live about a mile away from the refinery in Paramount. I'm going to piggyback off of this gentleman's question. He asked you guys what were the health effects of the emissions that you guys mentioned, like the VOCs and the SOx. You guys totally ignored his question.
So yeah, we have lots of information on that. I could go quickly, but we could sit down and go in a lot of detail. So I think the thing's of main concern out of a flare, right? So if you have, one of the purposes of the flare is to destroy the VOCs, right? VOCs have impacts on regional ozone levels, which are bad, but also have direct exposure to the VOCs, some of which are toxic gases, like benzene and benzene, some of the other types of toxic gases that could be associated with the refinery gas.
Like BTEX?
BTEX, yeah. So that's benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylenes. So the purpose of the flare is to not emit those toxics and other VOCs. But if the destruction efficiency that we talked about earlier isn't great, then some of that does escape. So that's one of the reasons why we want the destruction efficiency. So those types of VOCs, the BTEX, and even some others have toxic impacts. And I don't have my health effects officer here to describe specifically. Ian knows a little bit. If you want to know specifics about each compound and the types of health effects, we can go into more detail probably at another point. There's also the PM emissions that come out of a smoking flare, which are a real concern. That's one of our major challenges in Southern California. We know PM 2.5, which comes out of the flare, can have cause premature death, cause respiratory symptoms, cardiovascular symptoms, asthma, exacerbation, other types of things from the PM 2.5 itself. Other emissions from flares are the SOx emissions, which do have some impacts. Generally, those are located relatively close to the facility. Generally, we don't exceed. We have measurements of SOx in the Long Beach area. We generally don't see an exceedance of the health-based levels even during flaring, but it's something we're going to try to monitor for. You have NOx emissions out of a flare, which also can have some direct impacts. The NO2. There's probably more that I'm missing.
Secondary formation, SOx.
Yeah, so SOx and NOx also, once they get emitted to the air, you have direct exposure health effects from those, but they also get converted to PM 2.5. That generally takes some time, so we're talking about downwind, maybe hours or multiple hours downwind, but that forms PM 2.5, which has those effects as well. And then the VOCs can form ozone. That generally happens way downwind. So the flare is designed to reduce the risk of the types of pollutants that would otherwise come out of it. And if it's operating efficiently, it generally does its job. So part of the thing we're looking at is making sure it's done efficiently and not, there's emergency events with all that black smoke that's not desirable, right? Everyone knows that's not the desirable outcome. Unfortunately, in some cases, it's necessary for safety reasons, but we got to work on trying to minimize the frequency and risk of those types of events happening.
Okay, and my next question is, how do you guys regulate the trains that go to these facilities? Because they also emit different kind of plumes and smokes, and I'm just curious to how you guys regulate those, and
Unfortunately, we have
the health
very
effects
little
tied to them.
authority over the emissions that come from trains. That generally lies at the federal level. And the state has tried to do some regulations and has done some regulations on trains, but federal law limits the ability of the state even, much less the local agency, to regulate emissions from trains, unfortunately. Although, if you look at our recent air quality management plan, we are going to try to do our best to address those emissions under our authority. Also, we have lots of programs, incentive programs, and other ways and agreements that try to reduce those emissions in ways that may not be the traditional regulatory authority.
Because they're just as toxic.
No,
and,
we understand.
and
It's diesel. If it's a
it's
diesel train,
2017. Come on, it's like we don't need trains.
I'm not disagreeing. Diesel PM from trains and trucks is the #1. Jim will tell you the #1 cancer risk driver in the basin by far.
Exactly.
So we just don't have that authority, unfortunately.
So you said federal level. Who would I talk to, or where would I go to raise awareness on this? Never mind.
It is EPA. CARB has some efforts to try to, use whatever authority they have, and it's not clear. There's been court cases over this. We tried to do some regulations on trains years ago. It ended up in the U.S. Supreme Court. So it's not an easy issue.
Could you follow up with me with an email or something like that so I can further look into this for myself and my community?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
So if you give us your information.
Great, thank you.
Great. Yes.
Hi, Elaine Wilson again. I just want to share a success story. Over 17 years ago, I was in my newly purchased home on the fence line of the ExxonMobil refinery at that time, and my house started shaking. Well, apparently there are train tracks about 300 yards away from my home, and there was this huge engine. I looked up. It was like something out of a horror story. But the worst part of the horror was I found out that the engine was pushing tanker cars down the line, and they were using those tracks as a parking lot. Now, they had plenty of parking. So I knew the city had never done anything in the last 20 years. And I thought, well, the state wasn't doing much, so I called the EPA, okay? And they came out the next day, and they did say they can't regulate trains, but they could put some pressure to get those cars out of there. Now, these people in my neighborhood had been enduring this for 40 years. Breathing, they had to close their windows in the summer. They couldn't, the toxic fumes were coming out of those cars. And so they said, we'll get in touch with you. We'll come back in a couple of days. They did come back in a couple of days and said, we put some pressure on. The next day, all tanker cars were gone, the tracks were pulled up, and the poor people could now breathe.
thanks. Any other comments tonight? Questions?
Hello. Hello, AQMD. Thank you for being here and having this meeting, town hall. I had just a few questions. I'm from Paramount, and I know you guys have been out a lot about what's going on in Paramount, my community. I know there's so many other communities that are affected by these toxic chemicals. I was wondering, just to ask this one, is Rule 1118 rule, does it have jurisdiction over Paramount Petroleum?
Yes.
Okay, because it's over a certain amount of spec of their emission.
Generally, it's
that they
if
emit?
there's a refinery with a flare, then there's jurisdiction over it.
Okay.
My understanding is that generally that Paramount Petroleum is not flaring anymore. They had in the past, but generally not flaring anymore because of the nature of their operations.
Yeah, actually, in the past, what do you mean in the past?
Yeah, years past.
Oh.
There wasn't one last month or 3 months back?
Yeah.
I'm not going to say that there's zero emissions there, but the nature of their operation, zero flaring there now, but it's the nature is that it's significantly reduced flaring that's occurring at that facility today.
Oh, okay. Are you sure of that because of monitoring or because of calls, or how would you know?
They're required to report their flaring to us every 3 months. They report that to us, but we can go back and look at the specific details and report back on that to you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's why I asked you if they were under the rule, because
They're under the current rule, and they'll be under any amended rule.
oh, okay. Because they kind of don't call themselves a refinery still because they're downgraded, but then they have other side operations. Well, they're actually, because I live right next to Paramount Petroleum, there actually was a flare. She must have seen it too because it was at nighttime and it was going off, and it was probably a month or so ago. So that might be something to look into.
Yeah, we can definitely look into that. And just because a facility doesn't have a certain, name, there's in Rule 1118,
Right.
it has applicability. And
Right.
so we look at the applicability and how the rule applies to the facility. But we'll go back and we'll look, and we can have some of our compliance folks kind of, take a look and see if there's something that we should be concerned
And if
Yeah.
you have the date of that flare, it's something we can compare with
Yeah.
the records. So.
Okay, maybe we can come up with that, but I specifically don't remember, but it was within a month or month and a half. So definitely before the years gone back that you guys think of. Excuse me, I have all these little notes that I had a few questions. So when there's power outages, you said when there's power outages, you said when there's power outages that there is not that they are exempt from mitigation or type of disciplinary action.
So currently under the
with
rule,
your guys' rule.
So currently under the rule, if it's something that happens outside the facility beyond their control, it doesn't get added to their mitigation fee. But that's something we're looking at. We do have some limitations on raising fees under state law for things like that, but it's something we can talk about in these subsequent working group meetings. But it might have to be something that waits for like phase 2 of the rulemaking because of some limitations we have on fees.
They are required to still pay emissions fees. Every facility pays annual emissions fees on all of their emissions, and the emissions from even power disruptions or other external events, they still pay that normal emissions fee, but they don't pay specifically into the mitigation fund for 1118.
Oh.
I don't know if that makes any sense. There's different fees that apply.
And are they lower than your fees that you were talking about earlier?
Yes. Yeah, they're generally lower.
Because it just, it seems like that might be an important rule to make if there is power outages and they're talking about, we are looking into how we can do backup generators or how we can do switches that, can go to an alternative power source, and they're looking into it. Seems like they're looking into it for quite a long time. Is also another question I had, is there a time, is there actually time definition in the rule that you guys are coming up with now, 1118, that actually has like time, like a time definite or a time like that they need to
Like a compliance
do?
date, a date.
Yeah, like a compliance date.
certain. Yep.
Because it seems like they can say, we are working on it and we are looking into it, and that's not actually, being practically.
There's compliance dates in
results.
all our rules. Some provisions of a rule take effect immediately, and they have to comply immediately. Some, you have to give a facility a little bit of time to install equipment, and then, so we figure out how long that's going to take, and then compliance dates come right away, and typically they have to meet that compliance date. And sometimes there's provisions for extensions. That's not necessarily what we're looking at here, but we're going to take comment from everybody.
Oh.
Back to the power issue, and it is something we're looking at, and there are some limitations of what we can do there. But when we looked across the facilities at the power situation, and you saw the charts, that it's not that it doesn't happen at other facilities. It does happen at other facilities. But what's striking is what's happened at Torrance facility with the power outages. So now that we have this order for abatement, that is going to go a long way, and it may not be fast enough for some, and we got to keep working on it, and they're going to report back to our hearing board. We think that, that process is going to address a lot of the power issues, not just at Torrance, which will address most of the power issue emissions we've had throughout all the refineries. Doesn't mean we're not going to look at some of the other refineries as well to see if they can upgrade equipment, and it could be done in various ways through this rulemaking. One way is the fees, but again, there's some limitations on what we can do on fees on something beyond somebody's control. Ian talked about this alternative feasible compliance option, and that's something we always have to keep an eye on in terms of state law, what it allows us to do on fees.
Feasible in regard to the company themselves, that we're determining that they're not able to be feasible to be able to do it? Or
No, it's
or
something.
What is that? How's that determined?
We would make an evaluation.
Oh.
It's not up to the company if they submitted information. Right now, again, we're not sure how the zero. Right now, we're looking at a goal of zero planned emissions, and how we're going to deal with the unplanned emissions is a little bit of a separate issue, and that may be part of phase 2 coming back, depending on what we learn from the Torrance refinery experience on their power issues. And again, we have some limitations on what we can do, but at any time, whether it's a scoping document for zero planned or flare minimization plans or flare management plans under EPA, we don't take their word for it. We evaluate what they submit, and if we don't agree with that, then they have to resubmit, or there's other action that's taken.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the other point that I just wanted to make was that as we look at when we're developing the rule and we're looking at this goal, we feel like we can set that type of goal because we look at what other refineries are doing and how they manage their planned events, and what information can we gain from those that can be incorporated into the rule to essentially require other facilities to kind of hit that same goal.
If one's able to do it, the other one should be able to.
Right.
Okay.
So that's kind of, we focus on sort of what's happening at Torrance's, what we don't want to see. But then there's other things that we need to also that are important to highlight in terms of how other facilities do manage certain types of outages or other types of planned events, whether it's a turnaround and, how they manage their flaring, which I think is an important aspect when we look at the rulemaking.
Okay, I appreciate that. I appreciate your answers, because this is all about finding solutions to make a better enactment, right? A rule. I also was wondering about, this is also exempt. One of your exempting is a natural disaster, and I'm sure it's probably because you're like, well, they can't control a natural disaster, right? But in my opinion, if an industry that maybe is less safe has an event that, like a natural disaster happen, and they do happen, then if they're getting fined for it, then maybe they will think about maybe not being in such a dangerous industry, and they might be thinking of more safer energy industries, because in the rule you're saying they're exempt, but if they were fined, maybe they'd be like, okay, well, this isn't working.
Right.
And we would maybe be able to go towards a little safer future.
I'm going to ask Ian whether that 3 strikes and EPA rule has any exclusions for.
Yeah, my recollection is that the 3 strikes does have the same external disruptions, whether it's power disruption or natural disaster. There's still exemptions for that in the EPA rule in general.
Okay.
But-
Is there
but
any other rules about like educating the public about the hazards in the community as part of this 1118 rule?
Not specifically, other than we have these notification requirements in 1118, and you can sign up and get the notices for planned flaring events and then unplanned flaring events. Of course, it happens after the fact, but you can get all that data. So that's not even part of the EPA regulation we've been talking about. That's something that's exclusive to our rule. In terms of community outreach and education, at least within the Torrance community, that is something that some of the proposals that we received for the money that was collected from the Torrance refinery, some of those proposals have components that talk about community education and outreach in conjunction with some of the monitoring that could be set up.
I want to follow up on that. I believe in the order for abatement, there's an education and outreach portion of the order for abatement on their proposed plan. And in addition, the AQMD website has a specific page on 1118 and sort of all the various components of it. There's the rulemaking page, but actually goes beyond that, the one that has all the emissions reporting and all that. There's a lot of information on our website too.
Like something that's understandable for the community that they would be paying for? Is that what you're saying? Or who's paying for that?
So for our website, that's something that's a district website. That's the air agency's
right, the
website.
website.
For the public education component of the order for abatement, that's something the refinery would be responsible for.
And in addition to that, when we're looking at our Rule 1180 that we're looking at, which is a potential monitoring rule, part of that will be all the data that's collected will likely have to be disseminated, hopefully in real time, on a website that the refinery maintains, that we would have to kind of approve the format of, and likely would require that same website either have links or information on, what this data means in terms of health.
Oh, well, that's a good thing.
Right.
I was also, I've been hearing about, I'm not really fully clear about this, about, so inside the refinery, there's monitors, right? And they're multi-chemical, multi-metal type of monitoring.
Well, the monitors that I was describing they're actually sort of in the flare gas system itself. So yes, that's inside the refinery, but it's actually within the equipment itself.
Okay.
And there's various kinds of monitoring for looking at sulfur content or heating value, et cetera.
And
The refineries have a lot of other monitoring that aren't associated with flares as well, in terms of emissions on different stacks and safety monitoring and things like that.
right, and so, but that's all by themselves? There's not a third party monitoring, say, the emissions on site?
Right. The monitoring they do themselves. However, our current rule, our existing rule, actually has pages and pages of requirements for how to actually operate those monitors. They have to submit a plan to us of how they plan to monitor. We review and approve the plan or disapprove it and say, here's why it's disapproved, and you have to follow certain conditions. So there's a lot of requirements in the rule already on how to conduct the monitoring appropriately.
And they're subject to inspection and audit and all those things. So there's oversight by AQMD on the operation of not just the flare monitoring, but a lot of the other monitoring that they do at the refinery.
Okay. Oh, so there's oversight. So the monitoring, is that also certain kind of cameras that, like they were saying, some of the other community members, colored cameras that can see the types of colors that might be coming off the flare, and also the type of cameras that you can't see, like, by the naked eye,
The flare cameras are called. The infrared cameras.
like we couldn't get cameras over there at that one in the valley that was going off I don't remember what it was called.
Lisa
Oh,
Cameron.
yeah, and finally somebody in private in their house ended up putting a camera up, and they saw the gas coming out that they've been complaining about that they couldn't see with the naked eye. Are those type of cameras in the facility?
Currently,
Or-
right
or
now,
outside the facility?
there's currently a requirement right now that facilities have a color video monitor that records, or they have to keep 1 frame per minute continuously of their flares. Some facilities do more on their own as well, and they might do additional monitoring on their own. What we're proposing is to expand that and to try to find some of these other technologies like the infrared that you're mentioning, and maybe other technologies as well that are similar to try to look beyond just what the eyes can see typically and through a camera.
And so these other ones you're projecting that you'll try to have implemented, are these for them to implement or for you guys to implement? Because you guys are overseeing a lot of their monitoring, but I'm sure there can be like issues with that, it seems to me. Like, so what about outside of the facility and your monitoring? I mean, you had these ideas of fence monitoring, and the guy brought up drone monitoring. That sounds like a great idea. All right.
So I think there's, as Phil was mentioning, there's sort of a variety of different rules that we're looking at with monitoring. There's a rule specifically looking at fence line monitoring and potentially community monitoring as well, and that will probably have its own technologies and requirements for reporting and who's conducting it, et cetera. For this particular rule, 1118, that we're talking about now, we're talking about sort of very specifically monitoring of just the flare and just looking at that. And this first piece would be a pilot program that we would need we would require the refineries to cooperate in that study and evaluating the different technologies that are out there. I think we would be looking to take that pilot study from this first phase, evaluate how successful it was, what are the successes, what can we build on, and then incorporate that in the second rulemaking that we'd be pursuing later. And how the specifics of that implementation, I don't exactly know just yet. It's probably going to depend a little bit on the technology and what exactly we would want to have happen.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate what y'all are doing. AQMD, you really are our only defense. Especially EPA is getting cut by 31%. I'm sure that affects you. You guys get $2 million at least from that, I heard. So I'm just thinking, like, it just seems like it's a conflict of interest, some of their own monitoring that happens. How do you guys reassure the community that you guys are overseeing that?
I mean, I definitely
and
understand.
Not just doing it
yeah.
independently yourselves.
Yeah. I definitely understand the concern. So there's a lot of checks and balances on the monitoring that facilities do. This isn't the only rule that requires monitoring. There's many, many other rules we have, even at non-refinery facilities, that require monitoring. And they're subject to audit. They're subject to pretty strict quality assurance, quality control. Our inspectors are there. The refineries essentially have about an inspector each assigned to each refinery. So like one person per refinery, and they're out there, at least 2 or 3 times a week. So all of these systems are subject to inspection. The penalties for like falsifying data are really, really, really high. So we generally don't see that occurring in any case. I think that 80 million I mentioned earlier might have touched upon that a little bit. So generally we get pretty good compliance. We don't see that. I understand the fear of that, but generally in all our work and inspections, we don't see that happening on a regular basis or even frequently at all. So
Okay, so
pretty
pretty
confident.
much the teeth of the ruling and the new rules that they keep having, pretty much the teeth is the fining. Because we're a community from Paramount. We're Paramount against Community Coalition Against Toxic Chemicals, and we're noticing that all they're doing is just like getting shut down for a few days, and that's great. I mean, it's something, but it just seems like they just kind of like are playing the system a little bit. So pretty much it's the fining system, and that's the only way we're able to regulate.
That's the authority we have if they violate our rules is civil penalties. So we have the other authority is not with us, it's with our hearing board. And our hearing board could take additional action to shut down a facility or limit their production or impose other conditions. But in terms of our authority as a non-judicial, just as a staff level, that's where our authority lies in that civil penalty. Sometimes could be criminal penalties, but generally we don't have the authority to get those criminal penalties. Those go to we refer to a DA or something to go after someone criminally.
Okay.
But that's the teeth, and we need to make sure that the fines are sufficient to be a deterrent to
And
bad
no
behavior.
cap, right? That's what y'all trying to
And
do, right?
we have some limitations. The Health and Safety Code, California law, has caps on the fines we can recover under certain circumstances. So we're always cognizant, and even talking in Sacramento recently about whether those are sufficient to deter bad behavior. So it can be an issue, but again, like what we're looking at, like removing the cap in this rule is one way we might be able to go about that. So.
All right, well, appreciate y'all's
Okay.
work. Thank you.
Hi, I'm back. There actually was a flare-up at Paramount Petroleum on January 30th. So if you guys are reporting that there's no flares, does that mean no one reported it to you guys?
That's something we have to check.
And what is the time frame on reporting these? If this happened on January 30th, are we allowed to still report it? If we saw it and we just, because of life getting in the way, you know?
Well, first, if you see something like that and you're concerned, you should call our toll-free number, 1-800-CUT-SMOG, and record it, and we can try to get an inspector out to see what the issue is.
I have a picture of it, and
Right.
it's just alarming to me that you guys say that there's no flares,
Well,
and
No,
then
we need
didn't
to
say-
look into it, yeah. We will look into it.
It's possible they
Yeah.
reported, it's possible they didn't. If they
Yeah.
didn't, that's a problem. If they did, we still need to look into it. So let us get back to you, and you gave us your information, and we'll let you know what we find.
Okay, thank you.
I do want to say the reporting requirements currently under the rules, they report every quarter. So if it happened in January, we probably won't get that report until April timeframe.
Any other comments or questions? So definitely for the next working group meeting, it'll be in Wilmington. And we'll set it up in more of the true roundtable-ish type of a format. And it's the whole purpose of the working group meeting, which I think Ian probably hit on, is that we really want to have a dialogue. So the meeting will be more interactive through the presentation, and won't have this, we call this more of a workshop type style. So we encourage you to continue to participate. We thank you for coming out. And if you have any questions, we'll be here to answer questions. I want to make sure that everybody who's here did sign in, and you have your phone number, email, and your address, so then you can receive notices when we do our 75-day notice, where we release the rule language, and also for the 30-day notice when we get closer to the hearing. So that's it, and thank you very much for coming.